What a crowd. Good morning. Very impressive, very impressive. It's a real honor for me to be here today in the Windy City with all of you. And let's just start with the most important thing. We can win. You can change the world in 10 days. And with your help, we will bring America back. I'd like to say thank you to our hosts here, to the Salem Group, to AM 560. Thank you for Joe for introducing me, and especially to my Hungarian brother, Mr. Kulcsár. He did a great breakfast for us. I kind of missed the goulash, but it's great to meet him and to have him sponsor our breakfast. I'm going to talk to you about two things this morning, just to get things going before we get our host of amazing speakers here for the rest of the day. The first thing is about the book that Joe mentioned, Defeating Jihad, and why I wrote it, and what the message is. And secondly, how that message is indelibly linked to what's going to happen here on November 8th. So let's talk about Defeating Jihad. This is my first book, and when I got the contract, I was going to sit down and just write about jihadis. Yes, I eat, drink, and sleep counterterrorism. That's what I do. I'm honored to serve our warfighters, to serve our police officers in helping them understand who the enemy is. And I was going to sit down and, like a good Washington wonk, I was going to just start writing about jihadis. And then my wife, who's got a lot more common sense than I do, said, "Are you crazy? Do you actually want people to buy the book? You can't just dive in and talk about the stuff you love. You've got to connect with your audience. You've got to establish a relationship with your readers. And how do you do that?" Very wisely, she said to me, "You've got to give them a story. Americans love a good story. Don't dive in with the technical issues and how we're going to defeat them and the history. Establish a relationship with your readers." So I went back to square one, and I wrote a completely different opening chapter. It's a long prologue. It's about 30 pages. And I'm going to share it with you today in just a little kind of cliff note summary. And I think you'll understand why I wrote this prologue and what it means to America and to the current war we face. So imagine a 15-year-old boy walking through the streets of the city he grew up in 1945. That city has been practically destroyed. The city is Budapest, capital of Hungary. It was the site, most people don't know this, of the longest siege in World War II. By the end of the war, every single bridge across the Danube had been blown by the Germans. Out of every 5 buildings, 3 had been destroyed by bombing. It was a wasteland. And this young teenager is walking through the city, devastated, beautiful city. But he has hope. Why does he have hope? Because the war has ended, and he heard that some great men had sat down in a place called Yalta and signed a treaty to end the war. And these great men, including Churchill, had listed some guarantees on how the world would look after World War II. And one of the things that was in the Yalta Treaty was that all the nations of Central Europe, Hungary included, but Poland, Czechoslovakia, all of them, after the fighting stopped, would be allowed to get back to normal, would be allowed to choose their own governments, and would have democracy once more. So he had hope. But then what happened? Over the next 3 years, what did this young man see? He saw the Russians, who were occupying his country, slowly swallow it up. He saw their communist masters in the Kremlin create communist parties in Hungary And if you resisted them, first you would be intimidated. If that didn't work, if you tried to have independence for Hungary, you would be arrested, tortured, and eventually, if you didn't give up, you'd be killed. So by the time he started college, at the age of 18, he realized his country was being lost. There would be no freedom. There would be no democracy. So he decided to resist, but not with a gun, not with bullets, but covertly. So when he started college, he scoped out around him some other patriots, 8 other young men, Christians, who decided we have to stop the communists. And they created a secret organization to collect information about what the Russians and what the communists were doing. And to collect that information, troop movements, tank deployments, how they were swallowing up strategic economic assets of his country. And their plan was to send that information out to the West, to some Western government who could use it to stop Russia from gobbling up Hungary and the whole of Central Europe. And eventually, they found somebody who could get that information out, a man who had freedom of movement across the Iron Curtain. And just like a John le Carré spy novel, they'd write innocent letters, okay? And in between the lines of the letters, with invisible ink, they'd fill out the sensitive intelligence information. And then he'd smuggle it out to the West. Eventually, those reports did make it to a Western intelligence service. They established contact with MI6, the British External Intelligence Agency. And the reports started flowing to MI6 about what the communists were doing in Central Europe. The bad news was, at the end of that reporting chain, the man who was collecting all of it was none other than Kim Philby. If you know your Cold War history, Kim Philby was one of the 5 most lethal double agents of the Cold War, a traitor to Western democracy, one of the 5 Cambridge apostles, British men who were recruited at college to worm their way into the British government and spy for the Kremlin. So Philby was receiving these reports, and he let these brave young men do what they were doing until he could identify every single one of them. And when he had their identities, he betrayed them all to Moscow and the Hungarian secret police. The young man was arrested at the age of 20 with his colleagues. He was given a life sentence by the Communist Party of Hungary. That man was Paul Gorka, my father. He spent 2 years in solitary. I, as his son, still cannot understand that. Not 2 weeks, not 2 months, 2 years without human contact. Then he was put into a prison coal mine where the workers, I remember this is burnt into my mind, the prisoners, without explosives or machinery, had to break 10 tons of coal off the coal face every 24 hours. That was life in a communist prison. But eventually, what happened? 60 years ago this week, there was the first revolution against communism, 1956 in Hungary, the Hungarian freedom fight. And one of those freedom fighters, fighting for independence, captured a Soviet tank. And what did he do with that tank? He went to the communist prison and he liberated those people who had been put in prison because of their love of liberty, my father included. And as a result, he escaped from that prison. One of his fellow prison mates, an older, very elegant gentleman called George, said to my father, "If you get out of this prison, promise me one thing. Will you take my daughters out of this communist hellhole and get them to freedom?" And my father, who thought he was going to die in prison, said to George, "Sure, whatever, I'll take your daughters out of here." But now he was free, so he had to keep good. He had to make good on his promise. So my father, with one of those daughters, a 17-year-old called Susan, escaped to the west, hidden under a train, across a minefield into Austria, and into a refugee camp. They finally made it out to England, where I was born and raised, but very much with that background of understanding what a dictatorship is. Now, what on earth has that story got to do with a book entitled Defeating Jihad? I'll tell you. My parents were Hungarian. I was born in England. But today, I am a proud American. And when I saw those events of 15 years ago, on September the 11th, that beautiful sunny Tuesday. Do you remember how beautiful it was in New York? Not a cloud in the sky. When I watched those two planes full of terrorists fly into those buildings, I understood them a little bit differently from my fellow Americans. Because of my family background, I understood one thing in my blood. Freedom is as fragile as it is precious. Not only that, the great Ronald Reagan was let's give it up for the Gipper. The great Ronald Reagan was absolutely right when he said, "The loss of liberty is always but one generation away." If you are not a watchman on the wall, you don't have to wear the cloth of the Republic, you don't have to carry a badge or a gun, but if you don't do your part to protect our liberties, sooner or later, somebody will come along to take them away from you. So when I saw those two planes hit the Twin Towers, for me, it wasn't just terrorism. Yes, they were jihadi terrorists, but there was a bigger issue here. They were simply totalitarians. That's who they are. And there is a connective tissue that links groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the communists of the Cold War. There's a link between the jihadists, the communists, and the fascists that we fought during World War II. And that link is that they are all totalitarians. There is no negotiating with them. Either they will crush and enslave you, or we will crush them. It is that simple. And I like to remind my fellow Americans, because we kind of take this for granted. The 20th century is really the history of two existential threats to Western civilization: the Nazis and then the communists. Existential threats. And which nation was indispensable to the defeat of both of them? Absolutely, madam. Both of those enemies were defeated not by France, not by Britain. We love our British brothers, but it wasn't the Brits. Churchill was great, but they were losing the war. It wasn't the Belgians, it wasn't the Canadians. It was America. And guess what? To defeat this new totalitarian threat, it's going to have to be us again. And the reason I wrote Defeating Jihad is very simple. America is the greatest nation on God's earth. It is the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. And in this, the 16th year of the war, we are losing. And there is no excuse for that. Absolutely none. We need to win this war for the rest of Western civilization. Let me tell you, I don't know if you know this about Hungarians. Let me give you a little bit of a background. Hungarians, I'm an American, okay, but genetically I'm a Hungarian. Hungarians are born pessimists. I can depress you for hours, okay? So let me just indulge my genetic gene code for a second. But I'm an American now, so the conclusion's going to be happy, okay? So, all right? So I'll be a little bit bipolar this morning. Okay, so let's start with the bad news. Let's talk about ISIS. ISIS is the deadliest jihadi group in modern history. It is not a JV team. They're going to the Super Bowl. This is the first jihadi group in modern history to capture and control territory in multiple countries of multiple regions. Not just Iraq and Syria, but also Libya, also Nigeria. Boko Haram is part of ISIS. That's incredible. That's Africa. It's West Africa. ISIS controls territory now in multiple nations of multiple countries with more than 6 million people on that territory. It makes up to $4 million every day from oil sales, hostage taking, racketeering. They even have their own IRS that collects taxes from those 6 million people. $4 million a day. Now, why is that scary? Do you know how much 9/11 cost Al-Qaeda? That operation that did $1 trillion worth of damage to the United States in the first year, $1 trillion, cost bin Laden less than $500,000. ISIS makes $500,000 in a few hours. But the most important thing about ISIS, the reason it is so very, very dangerous, is what happened in Mosul 2.5 years ago. On June 29, 2014, the head of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, walked up the pulpit of the Grand Mosque in Mosul and declared the reestablishment of the caliphate, the reestablishment of the theocratic empire of Islam. And why is that important? Because a caliphate isn't some crazy idea dreamt up by a jihadi in a cave somewhere. The caliphate was a real entity for over 1,000 years. Established in Mecca 1,400 years ago, it still existed at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't run out of the Middle East by Arabs. It was called the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the last version of the caliphate. It was the empire of Islam. But what happened to the Ottoman Empire? In 1914, they put their money on the wrong horse. They thought the Germans and the Austrians were going to win World War I. So when 1918 rolls around, they are in trouble. So what do? An Ottoman officer, handsome man called Mustafa Kemal, has the answer. We're going to join the West now. We're going to modernize. We're going to convince countries like America that we are on their side. We may be Muslims, but we're on their side. That man, of course, would become President Atatürk of the Turkish Republic, the first head of state. And how did he make the Turkish Republic out of the building blocks of the Ottoman Empire? Very simply, he said, just like the founding fathers in America separated church and state, I am going to separate mosque and state. I'm going to remove religion from politics. Islam can have nothing to do with running this country. And just to prove to us how serious he was, what did he do? In 1924, over his own signature, the head of state of the new Turkish Republic officially dissolved the caliphate after more than 1,000 years. There was a little old man with a long white beard who was the emperor of Islam, the caliph, and they gave him his pink slip. Said, "Thank you, Mr. Emperor, you're no longer the emperor." Why is this important? Why am I standing here at the end of October talking to you about history almost 100 years ago? Because for the next 90 years, what happened? We had jihadi groups created all around the world who said, this is wrong. Who is this man to dissolve the empire? He's just some old soldier. He's got no religious credentials. We must bring the empire back. And it started with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And then it developed across the decades into Al-Qaeda. Hundreds of organizations created to bring back the empire. But for the next 90 years, every single one of them failed. All of them failed. But then along comes ISIS. And ISIS doesn't talk about creating a caliphate. ISIS just does it. That's why they're not the JV team. Unless we think this is just something happening 8,000 miles away in Mesopotamia. Let me bring it all back home to you. Why does this matter now? It matters because of something that occurred in a nightclub in Florida recently. Omar Mateen executed the greatest terrorist attack in America since September the 11th in the Pulse nightclub. But do you know what he did halfway through the massacre? He went to the restroom, put down his rifle, and picked up his cell phone, and he dialed 911. Not to get ambulances to the nightclub to save all the people he'd shot. No. But to make a statement to the dispatcher. 4 times. A statement which President Obama's Attorney General tried to censor. Why? Because Omar Mateen was very explicit about why he is killing Americans in America. 4 times he said, I am a jihadi. I am doing this for Abu Bakr, the new emperor of Islam. I am doing this for the caliphate of the Islamic State. That's in Florida. This isn't ancient history. This is right now. Let me give you some data so you realize how bad it is. My wife and I have a company called Threat Knowledge Group that supports the intelligence community, law enforcement, and special operations. And we wrote a report on the domestic threat to America of ISIS, collecting all the unclassified information on what ISIS is doing in America. You can download it. You can go to our website, threatknowledge.org. But let me give you a couple of data points. Since that day, 2.5 years ago, when ISIS declared the caliphate in Iraq, we have killed or arrested 112 ISIS terrorists here in America. Not 12, not 20, 112, with the latest one being the New Jersey, New York bomber. Of the 112, if you break them down into what they were doing when we caught them, this is the really bad news. Half of them, 45%, are what the FBI euphemistically calls travelers. Sounds like they're going on a holiday to Paris, right? These are Americans who've sworn allegiance to ISIS, want to fight jihad, but want to leave America to fight jihad. They want to go to Iraq, to Syria, to Libya to fight over there. Just under 20% are management-level terrorists, talent spotters, recruiters, facilitators, people who buy those young men their plane tickets to the Middle East, which leaves 38% of everybody we have intercepted, more than a third, are people in America who've sworn allegiance to Abu Bakr, want to become jihadis for the new caliphate, but have decided they are not going anywhere. They've decided the best way to serve the new emperor is to kill infidels right here at home. As a result of that inordinate percentage, we closed our report with the following conclusion. The likelihood of a Paris-style mass casualty attack happening in America is not a question of if, it is a question of when. We published that report 1 week before San Bernardino. And since then, we've had Orlando, Philly, New Jersey, New York. The war is real, ladies and gentlemen. The war is here. We have 10 days left to make sure that we put a person in the White House who's going to protect us, who's not going to censor the reality of the threat, and who's going to protect our nation. And I can tell you, because I've met him last year, before anybody took him seriously. Nobody took him seriously. Last year, Mr. Trump reached out to me, and he invited me to New York, and we met on several occasions, and we discussed national security. I'm not part of his campaign, but I advised him. And whatever somebody says about Mr. Trump, yes, his style is different. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. He's an alpha male, and I like alpha males, right? America was not founded by pajama boys, okay? George Washington was an alpha male, a God-fearing alpha male. That's what we need more of. And I can tell you something. As a man who sat across a table as this close to Mr. Trump and talked to him about ISIS, about Al-Qaeda, about Russia, I'll tell you something. Whatever you think of him, I'll tell you one thing. This man hates political correctness. With a passion. With a passion. Not only that, this man knows we are at war. And most important of all, this man wants to win that war. On the other side, we have a woman. I'm not going to say lady. We have a woman who just two issues should disqualify her from running for county dog catcher. Number one, this is an individual who knowingly and asked her team to put TSSCI, SAP, classified information, that is the highest level, yes, top secret, specially comparted intelligence, on a private homebrew server. Number one, disqualified. Just disqualified. But even more dangerous, I am so angered by all this garbage about Mr. Trump and Putin. Yes? If he was buddies with Vlad, wouldn't he have loads of casinos in Moscow? Right? Not one. There's not one Trump building in Russia. So explain that to me if he's bosom buddies, yes? But let's look at Hillary Clinton. When she was Secretary of State, this woman, as Secretary of State, had to sign off on a deal to sell 20% of America's uranium to Russian companies. 20% of our uranium, which is used for nuclear weapons, to companies that belong to the Kremlin. Because that was a strategic deal, she had to approve it. And she did. At the same time that her husband, Bill Clinton, received a $140 million speaking fee from the same Russian Kremlin companies. That isn't pay for play, that is organized criminal activity. Forget everything else. Forget the bilking the Haitian refugees after the earthquake. Forget all the money from Saudi Arabia. Those two issues alone should disqualify her from any public office for the rest of her life. Okay. Let me wind up here with some practical issues. I'm not allowed to do a Q&A now, which I'd love to do, but I'm around all day, so come and find me. If you want a signed copy of the book, we'll make that happen too. That's not important. Let's talk about the country. We've got 10 days to get it right, to save the nation. And already 3 people this morning said, well, you know, we're in Chicago, my vote doesn't count. Wrong! Wrong! Every vote counts. Every vote counts. This is unlike any election in American history. Every model, every template, throw it out the window. Yes, he has to win this state, has to win that state. Rubbish. We are seeing people vote who have never voted before, okay? This is a different ballgame, and we have to win it. So I have a personal request to all of you. And this goes to each, even if you're in a couple, okay, don't think of yourself as a couple. I want each of you to take this to heart. I have a personal request. 10 days from now, I want each of you to vote. But I want each of you to take at least 5 other people to the voting station with you. I want you to take people who were going to stay home. People who don't like leaving the house when it's raining. Because that's how we lost last time. We had Republicans stay home. The stakes of this election cannot be over-exaggerated. I want everybody to understand this, however old you are, this is the most important election in your lifetime. Bar none, the most important. And we need to mobilize, because you know something, the other side is going to mobilize, like they always do. And these last few days, when you're talking to people, you're trying to convince people who just can't believe the news yesterday, yes, that this man who's in inappropriate relations with a 15-year-old, yes, is this close to Hillary Clinton, right? Those people who are Democrats or maybe changing their mind about Hillary, don't try and argue with them based on logic. That's our big mistake. Forget the logical arguments. Do what the Democrats do. Emotion. Appeal to their heart, okay? Emotion. And even the young kids that you know, your children, your grandkids, I recommend one incredible weapon to you. Just tell them to go online and watch the video on YouTube of Clinton Cash. They're not going to read the book, but there's a 1-hour video called Clinton Cash. And even a millennial that thinks global warming is the greatest danger to America, right? When they watch the first 16 minutes of that film about how the Clintons took money away from the survivors of the Haitian earthquake, they will never, ever vote for Hillary, okay? Use the emotion. Use the emotion. Use the heartstrings. That is my request to you. Also, get really active on social media. Follow me. I'm at Seb Gorka on Twitter, at Seb Gorka. Repost my stuff. I'm trying to get people energized, get the message out there. And again, remember, we can win. God bless.